Before there were glasses, there was a moment almost everyone feared. It arrived so slowly that most people didn't even notice it at first. One day, you held a book a little farther away. A few years later, you found yourself searching for brighter light. Then one morning, no matter how hard you squinted, the words refused to come into focus. Your eyesight hadn't disappeared. It had simply grown old. For thousands of years, that was the end of the story. There were no eye doctors, no surgery, no treatment. If reading was your livelihood, your career slowly slipped away. If your work depended on precision, so did your future. Humanity had accepted this as an unavoidable part of life, until someone discovered that a simple piece of curved glass could fool the human eye. That discovery wouldn't just help people see again. It would quietly extend careers, preserve knowledge, fuel literacy, and change the course of human civilization. So, how did humanity invent spectacles? The story begins long before the first pair of glasses was ever worn. Long before anyone understood how vision actually worked. For thousands of years, people noticed something peculiar. Certain pieces of polished crystal made objects appear slightly larger. If you looked through them at tiny letters or intricate carvings, the details suddenly became easier to see. No one knew why. They simply accepted it as a curious property of certain transparent stones. The ancient Romans even experimented with glass vessels filled with water, discovering they could magnify objects beneath them. It wasn't science, it was observation. Useful, but not revolutionary. Because looking through a crystal was one thing, building something that could restore failing eyesight was something else entirely. Then, sometime around the 10th century, monks across Europe found an ingenious solution. Instead of holding a crystal above a page, they shaped glass into a smooth, rounded dome and placed it directly on top of the text. The result became known as a reading stone. As the curved glass bent light, the letters beneath appeared larger, allowing older monks to continue reading manuscripts they could no longer see clearly with their own eyes. For the first time, growing old didn't always mean giving up books. It was a remarkable invention. But it came with an obvious problem. A reading stone only worked while it rested on a page. You couldn't wear it while writing. You couldn't carry it as you walked. And it did absolutely nothing for the world beyond the book beneath it. The solution wasn't to make the stone bigger or clearer. It required a completely different way of thinking. What if, instead of placing the lens on the page, you placed it in front of the eye? It sounds obvious today, but that single idea would take centuries to become reality. Because before humanity could invent glasses, it first had to understand something far more mysterious. How does the human eye actually see? For centuries, nobody truly understood how vision worked. Many believed your eyes actually sent out invisible rays that allowed you to see the world. It sounds strange today, but for hundreds of years, it was one of the leading explanations for human sight. Then, in the 11th century, an Arab scientist named al-Haytham challenged that idea. Instead of asking what our eyes do, he asked a different question. What does light do? Through a series of experiments, he demonstrated that light travels into the eye, not out of it. More importantly, he showed that curved pieces of glass could bend that light in predictable ways. It was a breakthrough that changed optics forever. But here's the interesting part. al-Haytham never invented glasses. He simply explained the science that would eventually make them possible. Sometimes, understanding a problem is just as important as solving it. Over the next 2 centuries, his work spread across Europe, inspiring scholars to study light, lenses, and vision in ways they never had before. At almost the same time, another piece of the puzzle was quietly falling into place. Glassmaking. Not all glass is created equal. Early glass was often cloudy, filled with bubbles and tiny imperfections that distorted everything behind it. It worked for windows, but not for precision lenses. And northern Italy changed the game. By the late 13th century, cities like Venice had become famous for producing some of the clearest glass in the world. Their craftsmen had spent generations refining techniques that allowed them to shape transparent glass with remarkable accuracy. And suddenly, someone had an idea so simple, it almost seems inevitable. Instead of placing a magnifying lens on the page, why not place it in front of the eyes? Sometime around the late 1200s, the world's first wearable spectacles appeared in northern Italy. They looked nothing like the glasses we wear today. There were no arms that hooked around your ears, no lightweight frames, no nose pads. Just two convex lenses connected by a small rivet, balanced awkwardly on the bridge of the nose, or sometimes held in place by hand. By modern standards, they were clumsy. But for someone who had slowly watched books disappear into a blur, they must have felt almost miraculous. For the first time in history, growing older no longer meant the end of reading. Monks could continue copying manuscripts. Scholars could keep studying. Merchants could read contracts again. Years of knowledge no longer vanished simply because the human eye had aged. It seemed like the problem had finally been solved. Except, it hadn't. Because these first spectacles only worked for one kind of failing eyesight. Millions of other people still couldn't see the world clearly. And solving their problem would take another breakthrough. The earliest spectacles solved one problem remarkably well. They helped people who struggled to see things up close as they grew older. But if you were born unable to see distant objects clearly, they were practically useless. For centuries, people with nearsightedness still had no solution. Then, sometime during the 15th century, craftsmen developed concave lenses, glass curved in the opposite direction. Instead of helping aging eyes focus on nearby objects, these lenses corrected vision for people who couldn't clearly see the world in the distance. For the first time, spectacles weren't just helping people grow old, they were helping people see better throughout their lives. But even then, glasses remained surprisingly rare. Not because they didn't work, because most people simply didn't need them. Books were expensive, handwritten, and incredibly uncommon. Outside monasteries, universities, and wealthy households, few people spent their days reading. Then, in the middle of the 15th century, another invention changed everything: the printing press. Suddenly, books that once took months to copy by hand could be produced in large numbers. Knowledge spread faster than ever before, literacy began to rise, and millions more people found themselves doing something their ancestors rarely did: reading. Almost overnight, clear vision became more valuable than it had ever been. The demand for spectacles exploded. Glassmakers refined their craft. Frames became lighter. Lenses became more accurate. What had once been a tool reserved for monks and scholars slowly became an everyday necessity. The story didn't stop there. Over the centuries came stronger materials, lighter frames, and more precise lenses. Benjamin Franklin introduced bifocals, allowing people to see both near and far without changing glasses. Later came metal frames, plastic lenses, contact lenses, and eventually laser eye surgery. Each innovation solved a different problem, but they all traced their origins back to one simple idea: place a carefully shaped piece of glass in front of the human eye. Looking back, spectacles don't seem like a revolutionary invention. They don't make loud noises. They didn't reshape battlefields. They never conquered nations. Yet few inventions have quietly changed so many lives. They allowed scholars to keep learning, writers to keep writing, craftsmen to keep creating, doctors to keep operating, scientists to continue making discoveries long after age would once have forced them to stop. In many ways, spectacles didn't just help people see more clearly. They helped humanity think for longer. And perhaps that's what makes their story so remarkable. The greatest inventions aren't always the ones that change the world overnight. Sometimes, they're the ones so ordinary that we forget a world once existed without them. The next time you put on a pair of glasses, remember that you're wearing the solution to a problem humanity lived with for thousands of years. A simple invention that quietly changed civilization,